Hello and welcome. Today I am joined by Stuart Paterson, who is the National Team Lead Physiotherapist at the Scottish Rugby Union. So welcome, Stuart.
Hi Andy, how you doing?
Doing very well, thank you. Thank you very much for giving your time today. And we were just chatting about the differences of England and Scotland on the COVID response, but we'll leave that topic for another time on this one. But yeah, going straight in then. So where are you actually from originally?
I'm from a town in southwest Scotland called Ayr, which is southwest of Glasgow, so about sort of 40 minutes away from Glasgow. So that was me, born and bred there, until I went to uni at 17.
Right, okay. And then, so when you go into uni at 17, which is slightly different to in England, but at what point did you decide what you wanted to do at university?
I think I was probably one of those confused kids at school of not really knowing what I wanted to do. I think originally I tried to leave school at 16 and go and join the Royal Marines. And then my parents got wind of it and swiftly got me back into doing education. So I think probably came about from just playing sport, playing rugby, football, picking up niggles and injuries, and then seeing physios off the side of that. And I think when I went to uni, I remember my application was for physio, I think PE teaching or sports science. So it was kind of a very broad thing. I don't think I was sold on being a physio originally, because I think, sports physio is that small percentage, isn't it? Whereas the spectrum you have to go through at uni is massive. So yeah, so I don't think I was hell-bent I'm going to be a physio, to be honest. It took a bit of time to get there.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely empathise with that. So I did sports science and I did it because I liked sport and I wanted to go to university, so it wasn't that scientific really. But then, so for your course then, it gave you the option to do any of those three things. It's sort of giving you the pathway.
So no, you just applied through UCAS. So I'd applied for those three different courses and then got accepted. I think I had to get certain grades in my final year at school to get in. But I think at that stage it was like my parents were both teachers, so they were putting me off teaching because at that time there wasn't many jobs in teaching. So they were going, oh, not a good career choice. And then I don't know, I think I was probably nudged by somebody towards physio, and I probably my dad, but I don't think there was anything that stood out of, go and do it. It was just very much seemed something that I enjoyed to get treated by and enjoyed that aspect of things. So have a wee look and see what it's like.
Yeah. And then, so you decided to do physiotherapy, and then at what point when you're doing that do you think, actually, yeah, this is something that I definitely want to be involved in? Like, where did that come from?
I think not until I graduated, to be fair, Andy. I didn't enjoy, this is going to sound bad, I didn't enjoy my first couple of years at uni in terms of, it was all very new, very different. You were asked to do subjects that just didn't probably interest me in terms of some of those specialities, in terms of maybe obstetrics, gynecology, medical, surgical. You've got all those things which probably didn't float my boat. So I think at the end of our second year, so it's obviously a 4-year degree in Scotland versus a 3-year degree in England as an undergrad. So at the end of your second year, you get on placements. And my first placement was at the spinal injuries unit in Glasgow. And I think probably at that point, I started to really enjoy doing physio, because you could see a real benefit, to rehabbing people and helping them get better. And then I still enjoyed sports. I think between my third and fourth year, I was lucky enough to do a bit of travelling. So I went around Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, kind of in our summer off. And when I was in New Zealand, I stopped by the University of Otago and caught up with a lecturer there who was kind of did a lot of research in rugby, and I then sort of started to explore doing a postgrad out there. So probably end of each year, I kind of picked something up that just made me start to kind of really enjoy physio. But certainly, I think once I started working, although it was originally NHS work, I just started enjoying that, because the reality is you become a physio, I think, to help people, and make a difference. And get people back to doing things they want to do. And so by the time you're out working and doing that, you actually start to, I guess, get a sense of purpose of what your role is.
Yeah. Yeah, and so was it that trip to New Zealand then? Did that give you the impetus to say rugby was what you wanted to do, or was that more your main sport than football?
Oh yeah, rugby's always been probably my main sport. I think that trip to New Zealand and speaking to that guy certainly then drove me down the lines of thinking about a postgrad and kind of specialising more into sports physio, because that would have been summer of 2000 I did that. And then so I was graduating summer 2001. So I think then ended up back in New Zealand in January 2004 starting my postgrad. And so those kind of postgrads then you'll be aware a lot of things are distance learning now, all done online, but these were kind of get in, you could do it full time and be immersed for 18 months to do your masters, do you know, where it was classes daily. It was like being an undergrad again, do you know, but really focused on sports physio and manipulative physio. So yeah, definitely that trip really hammered home that I wanted to be probably involved in sport. And then it was just working out how do you actually get into sport probably.
Yeah, so over there then, so were there many international students? Because rugby's obviously massive in New Zealand, but what was the dynamic like?
Yeah, no, there would have been, I reckon, probably 50-50 in terms of international students to home-based students. With guys there from Sweden, Greece, India, I mean, everywhere. It was just, it was an eclectic bunch of people all doing different things, just, not necessarily all wanting to get involved in rugby, but more probably because I would say New Zealand and Australia were looked at as being pretty handy in terms of manual therapy. The Mackenzie Institute stuff, in terms of that was one of the masters that ran alongside the one I was doing. So we had Robin Mackenzie teaching the course. We had these kind of older generation New Zealand guys that were probably very at the front end of the game back in their day in terms of manual therapy and things. So there was a big draw to go these places, Andy.
Mm. And so what was it like actually moving over and living in New Zealand for a couple of years?
Well, so originally I was going for the 18 months and then I came back 6 years later. So it was obviously good. So originally I went out, was just going to study. You could do, as part of your student visa, you could pick up sort of 20 hours a week in part-time work. So I was lucky enough, one of the guys on my course was a partner in a clinic and they were looking for somebody to kind of help cover because he was in the course as well. So I ended up working with a guy, Steve Griffin, who was kind of quite well known in New Zealand circles in terms of sports physio and manual therapy stuff. So I worked for him. I got working with him within about 3 months, I think, of arriving. And then he offered me a job, kind of full-time job for when I finished. So that allowed me then to get my residency. So I could then stay in New Zealand. So he worked closely with a guy, Pete, who's now the current All Blacks physio, because he was the Highlanders physio at the time. So he knew Peter. And so we would get, when he was away, we would get the Highlanders guys into the clinic. I started doing a bit of work with the Otago Rugby Academy as part of kind of the clinic, and also just myself as kind of recovery days. And I think what I found very quickly was New Zealand is just better set up to get into sport comparatively with Scotland, at the time. So it was great. Like Steve Griffin was a phenomenal kind of mentor from a private practice perspective, but he did sort of high level netball, which is also a huge sport in New Zealand. With the connections with rugby, the Academy of Sport we had connections with. So it just kind of started to flourish quite quickly, which was, exciting as a young single man at the time. Like physio is a great degree. If you can get that transferred over somewhere, you can travel the world with it and do exciting things, do jobs and just experience different things and learn. So no, it was good. I would highly recommend it to people.
Yeah. So how was that transition from your perspective then? So what were you doing just before you went to do the Masters?
So when I graduated, I worked in a hospital just kind of outside of Glasgow in North Lanarkshire called Monklands Hospital, just as a junior physio. So I started doing rotations, just, you know, your simple sort of 3-4 month, I think it was 3 months at the time, rotations through surgical, intensive care, those things. And then after about a year, it kind of felt like it wanted to move, just because it was quite a small hospital. We were very lucky probably back then, because I had a job before I even graduated. There was physio jobs, there was loads of them. You know, they were really looking for us. Now seems like there's not so many physio jobs for the graduates to get. And then I moved into Glasgow to the two big main hospitals on the south side, just as a junior, so a sideways move. But I thought going into a bigger hospital would expose me to more people, more opportunities in terms of becoming a senior physio as well. So I then went over, and that was they've now changed. It was the Southern General and Victoria Infirmary, and now they've got this big massive hospital that kind of covers both things. So I worked there as a junior and then got a role as a senior physio. And I think the last kind of thing I was doing there was kind of rheumatology, which funnily, rheumatologists seemed to be involved in sport at the time. Do you know, that they seemed to be the go-to sport people from a hospital base for some strange reason. No idea why, but the consultant I worked with, a guy, Mr. Larkin, Dr. Larkin, he was really into sport, so kind of talked to him a lot about it. And then I think I'd mentioned earlier about wanting to join the Marines. I'd actually applied then to join, I looked at the Royal Army Medical Corps. So I still had this thought process in my head of doing that. And again, I think it was working with people that want to get fit, want to do things, maybe intrinsically motivated, you know, and then didn't get into that. So I was like, what will I do now? Phoned Pete Milburn was the guy's name out in New Zealand, emailed him. He said, we've got these master's programs. So I thought, why not? What's the worst that can happen? Was able to fund it. So I thought, why not? And off I went.
He was funding that they funded that, did they? Or?
Oh no, I was just lucky enough at that time. A relative had passed away, so I inherited some money. So it was, I could save it, do what most young early 20s males would do, have a few holidays and enjoy it, or it would cover me to kind of pay for my masters and pay for the 18 months I was out there. So there was no pressure to work or things. I thought, you know, why not? It's a masters in manipulative and sports physio. It's going to really, at that stage I was interested, if that makes sense, Andy. Like I suddenly found that passion to actually enjoy physio and really knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to get into sport. I enjoyed the NHS, and I would highly recommend it to people in terms of communication skills, broad understanding of what physio is, getting a great understanding of the conditions you can see, you know, when you, even if you're in private practice, that walk in and just catch you out. But I knew it wasn't for me long term. It was, you know, it just didn't push my buttons, you know, to get me going in terms of be passionate about it.
Yeah. So, and what were the differences then? So when you went over there, you were doing the masters, but you were also working part-time in the private clinic. Were there any key differences from a physio perspective that you could see?
Way more hands-on. So like my hands-on skills just exponentially got better. Part of because of the course, clinical reasoning was really driven, you know, like as part of your postgrad, which I think was probably talked about as a junior. But I don't think you ever sat down, like, you know, a good example would be, we had to do an exam every year where it was a real patient came in off the street. You had two lecturers sitting behind a plinth just watching. So you had to go in, you had to do your subjective exam, leave the room so they could then ask any further questions they wanted to do. You had to then write out what you thought it was, what you were going to do objectively. You do your objective exam, leave the room, they would do anything else they wanted to do, and then you'd come back in, speak to the patient, give them your rehab, send them on the way, and then get grilled for another hour after that about what you were doing and things like that. And that just was a mind-blowingly new concept for me as a junior physio, was going in, even as a senior physio in the NHS, was nobody had ever done that. Nobody had ever sat and watched me really assess somebody after becoming qualified and really pushed why you're doing things. Now, I'm sure they do that in all the kind of postgrad masters courses, and I think obviously you'll know it's pushed way more now in terms of clinical reasoning and why you're doing things rather than just doing things. But I think those were probably the big differences, and just access to patients or players or athletes is easy in New Zealand. They have an insurance thing called ACC, where if you're out, Andy, and you're a kind of weekend warrior playing rugby, if you do your medial ligament, you just book yourself to see the physio on Monday in a private practice, and it's covered by that insurance.
Right.
So you get the ankles, the knees, the shoulders, the ACLs, and then if you've got an ACL, you get referred to a sports doctor. They'll send you for a scan. Get the scan, you'll see an orthopaedic guy, and you'll have your surgery. And then they come back to you and you get your rehab. So it's set up to do that. Whereas here, if you don't have private healthcare, you're kind of hoping that somebody will notice that you've got this gubbed knee on a Monday morning and might think it's a good idea to get in and see the physio. Do you know? And I know they're doing more of these sort of first point of contact physio things, but it just exponentially grows your examination, your treatment, your rehab, all these things, just because you're given the opportunity to do it. You're not dealing with a 20-year chronic low back pain. You know, you're dealing with somebody that, you know, did something at the weekend within 40 hours or within 24 hours, do you know?
Yeah, no, definitely. So you're doing the masters, you've completed that, working in this clinic, and then so how does that transition to being full-time happen?
So I then moved up to Wellington. So I spent 2.5 years in Dunedin. I was doing that down there. So I worked with the Otago Rugby Academy down there, just part-time, just helping recovery days and things. As I said, doing that stuff in the clinic. And Steve had kind of lots of contacts. So I then was actually going up to Hamilton with Otago Athletics as their squad. So I stopped at Wellington Airport for a layover just for like an hour and a half. I had a quick interview for a private practice in Wellington. And the guy that ran the private practice was the head physio at the Hurricanes Super Rugby franchise. So got that job, moved up to Wellington, then started doing the Wellington Rugby Academy part-time, and then that became a full-time role. And then from there, I went in as the physio for the Lions, which was the ITM Cup. I guess maybe the Mitre 10 Cup or something now, I can't remember. And that was full-time there. And that was Jamie Joseph was the head coach, who's now the Japan head coach. He was the head coach there. And then I moved on, being the physio of the Hurricanes the year after. And it was Colin Cooper was the head coach there. And I think we had a stat team, to say the least, you know. So it was just small wee stepping stones and opportunities. And I think one of the things was interesting. My first full-time contract in sport was for 6 months. So I had to give up the good money in the private practice and all these things and just have a go. And in my head, I was like, well, it's either going to work out or it's not. If it doesn't work out, you'll find another job. You know, you'll find private practice work or things, was my attitude. But I was also like, you know, you've sometimes just got to take a punt. Now, it helps if you're single and you're young, that you can have a punt at these things. I think the tougher bit, the older you get, is the expectations are more in terms of contracts and money and things, where I was just like, well, this is what I want to do. So I'll have a go, and if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. And it worked out brilliantly for me. You know, I think it became about, so I think New Zealand for me was, if you worked hard and did well, you got rewarded. I think sometimes I wondered about the UK being a bit about who you knew to get your foot in the door, rather than actually, there's a job up there, get on, you know, if you do well, you'll be rewarded.
And what was it like going from working with private practice patients through to like these supreme athletes then?
I think, like obviously the difference is the amount of contact you get with them. You know, so you managing probably egos. as much as anything else. I think the transition is how much time you can get with them. In New Zealand private practice at that stage, you would get 15 to 20 minutes per person. That's not a lot of time to get somebody in, reassess them, treat them, and get them out the door with something meaningful to do. So I think in terms of like the pro guys, the biggest transition was time. You suddenly had time, although saying that I was the only physio with 35 people. So you still had to cover pitch side, when the session was on, and manufacture your rehab times around it. But we just had to, I think it really drove home the multidisciplinary stuff in terms of working with the conditioners massively, of like, what can we actually get in with their strength and conditioning, start as part of our preventative work. And that was kind of the biggest difference, was like time. I had time, but I didn't have time in a strange way. So where could we get best bang for our buck? Whereas in the clinic, you were just like, I'll see you in a couple of days' time. These guys are like, I'll see you this afternoon, I'll see you the next day. How long have we got? So it was, I guess it was the ability to manage different people and different attitudes and egos. But I think probably the biggest things is they're just normal guys. Anywhere I've gone in the world and been lucky enough to work with different athletes, they're just same as you and I. They're just normal people. They're just bloody good at something. And so they've been given the ability to do that as a job. And so they're no different. I mean, I think I'm very lucky at the moment. I think guys in Scotland are brilliant guys as well. They enjoy what they do, they come into work, and they see it as being, it's a job, but it's a fun job, and they just be themselves and have fun. And I think, that's probably the difference, is that the big difference between pro athletes and sometimes somebody just in that private practice is they're motivated. Like people are talented and get so far, but they've all had to work at some stage. Like some people will suggest that some people got it easier than others. Well, that's in all walks of life. Whatever job you do, somebody's got a photographic memory. They didn't have to read the book as many times. So I think big difference was time with them, and then realizing they're just normal guys, that young fellas in their 20s that on a Saturday night just want to have a beer with their mates as well.
Yeah. And did you see any, I suppose this is going forward a bit, but were there any cultural differences in like their attitudes to playing?
I think talent pool in New Zealand is huge. They, like in Scotland, we pick up a football as our first kind of choice of sport. They pick up a rugby ball. And so their talent pool's there. So their attitude is they will train. Because if you don't train, you're not going to get picked. And if you don't get picked and you don't play, there's another cab sitting on the rank ready to go. And I think so. Culturally, you've obviously got various cultures as well in New Zealand in terms of Polynesian guys, Maori guys. I think that blends into kind of well into their culture out there in terms of family. Like Colin Cooper as a head coach at the Hurricanes was massive on family. Always wanted to make, if you had any family stuff, that he would help deal with it, and made it a big thing about family being part of the journey that was on for the team. I think in Scotland, as I said, I think the talent pool is getting there. Like, I mean, we had 8 new caps last weekend, which is genuinely exciting. All of them were really good, and I think it's now that talent pool is starting to really come through within Scotland in particular, but in the Northern Hemisphere comparatively with the Southern Hemisphere, so I think, is there big cultural differences? I think there's some, but related to actual genuine cultural differences in terms of like backgrounds and where people are from. But I think ultimately everyone now is trying to create the same environment, which is an environment where people feel, I guess, that they are safe, that they can express themselves, can have an opinion and do these things, and not be worried about anything. I think, that's where we're all leading towards, is those kind of environments. But yeah, I wouldn't have said there was huge cultural things. I think it was just the talent pool was very different. So you may, and seasons were different. Do you know, like I came from, it was Super Rugby, which was Super 14 at the time. So you started in December or November, end of November, beginning of December, you were done by May. And then you kind of had this break period, and then they would go into ITM Cup or guys go to the All Blacks or wherever. Whereas here it was turn up and it's like, right, you're starting in July and you're going till the end of May, you know, and it's game after game after game. So how you manage people becomes very different as well. So something that if you only got 2 games left, you can get them through that. But if you've got 6 months left, you may be going, oh, might not be able to get this guy through 6 months of this. You know?
Yeah. No, definitely. And then, so when you decided to, so you've been in New Zealand, what prompted you to want to come back to Scotland?
I got married, so it was more of a kind of, at that time was a probably family choice versus career choice, but I was lucky that Edinburgh Rugby at the time, which sits under the umbrella of Scottish Rugby, were needing a head physio at the time. So came back to get married, had a job interview, and then 3 months later was back in the country. So it was, it's been great. And that was January 2010 I returned and started work with Scottish Rugby, but with Edinburgh.
Right. So is that something, so you had a relationship while you were out in New Zealand, and then how did that happen? Because like you went over there, were you with this person then?
Oh no, that's another story. that's one for another podcast, mate.
Okay, yeah. So you came back, and then what was that all like then, moving back to Edinburgh and getting involved in that?
Yeah, like it was exciting. You know, you get back to Scotland and, you know, I think day one I went to watch Glasgow and Edinburgh play. My dad had picked me up from the airport, took me through to Murrayfield, and the snow was coming across the pitch. The rain was coming down, and it was like a 9-6 classic winter game of rugby. And I was thinking to myself, what have I done? Because I just left 31 degrees on the beach with some mates because we had time off. I was thinking, I've had a shocker. But it was a great move. I mean, I came back and straight away I had a physio team versus, as I said to you, it was me and 35 players. I now had me plus 2 other physios for 35 players. So suddenly I was like, oh, what do we do all day? Do you know? And it kind of opened up that realm of, actually, we now have time to do this, this, and this. And then, so I did that until about 2014. In 2014, my boss at the time, Paul McGinley, started to involve me with the national team as well. So there was Paul McGinley, Stephen, who's now the head physio with the national team in Ireland, were there. So I came in and started working with those guys in 2014. And then Vern Cotter got involved with Scotland at that time as well. And he invited me to be involved with the World Cup. And then I sort of did this dual role where I was still the head at Edinburgh, but doing the national team as well, till about 2017, I think it was. And then it kind of got that full transition over into the national team. And then it was national team and over kind of work with their academy physios. And then Paul McGinley, my old boss, he took up a great opportunity to go and work with Cirque du Soleil. So he went off with them, and then we kind of restructured things. So then that kind of, I took on aspects of his job and things like that. So it's been a great kind of, whatever it is now, 10, 11 years. I forget so much. I think it was the other day when I realised I'd been qualified for 20 years. I was like, wow. How did that happen? So yeah, again, opportunity, put your hat in the ring, works out for you, and then just work hard and get rewarded for that, I think is kind of my attitude or my feeling on what happened there.
Yeah, and just comparing again New Zealand to Scotland then. So in terms of the medical department, so you talked about the people, whereas there was only one person, you over there in New Zealand. What was the medical setup like? Was that a similar infrastructure in terms of technology, space?
I think like we had, I'm trying to think. So New Zealand, we would have had a team doctor, myself, a couple of S&C coaches. And that was kind of really the performance side of it. The year that I left, we had managed to get another physio in. So they were starting to expand, but I do know, I mean, until recently, I think one of the Super Rugby teams was still running with just one physio. In terms of space and technology, again, GPS was obviously starting to come through at that stage a bit more. The head of S&C, who's there now, Davy Gray, came in just as I was going, and came in as an assistant first. So Davy had a lot of innovation in terms of technology and things around that he brought in, but GPS was probably the big thing. It was kind of a no frills approach. You had your gym, rehab. We had the old jump mat at one stage, so we did a lot of stuff on the jump mats. But that's obviously evolved into various other things now across that spectrum of looking at counter movement jumps, rate of force development, and all these sort of things. So I think the evolution of technology has been massive. But I would have said, coming back to Scotland, what did we have? We had more staff, so we had as I said, 3 physios now. We had a doctor who was there part-time as well. We had James Robson, who was available because he's based at Murrayfield a lot of the time anyway. So we always had that sounding board there, more S&C coaches. So it's just, in terms of technology, then it was sort of GPS stuff came in. And I think GPS was probably the big thing that everyone kind of jumped into to begin with in terms of that technology. And then, as we said earlier, you kind of then some of the teams have gone in down with shockwave, ultrasound, adding that into medically, handheld dynamometers, any of these things to try and really objectify what we're doing. Whereas before you would be returning somebody and going, right, well, what can they lift? So it would be in the gym, what can they lift there, but not be able to maybe isolate something to really truly understand what was going on. Whereas now you've got handheld dynamometers, so you can isolate a movement a lot better, whether that's pushing, pulling, isometric, any of these things. Then you've got force plates that can give you rate of force development with the upper limb, lower limb. How high do they jump? How high is their jump this point of the week compared to what it was at the start of the week? Are they recovering? And I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know where to sit with all the technology. I don't know whether it has just clouded everything. I always say to people, it's 10 years ago we could return a grade 2 medial ligament in 4 weeks, but now it appears to take 6. Why? Yeah, maybe we're just flying by the seat of our pants 10 years ago. But I think that technology has brought amazingly great things with it, but has maybe actually made people really question their clinical decision making and things, because the number says, my plan says this, so we've got now these really detailed plans, and I push them in the organisation I work for, but I sometimes it's that ability to be fluid with that plan, I think is starting to panic people, because if the number doesn't say they're right and they go and play and it fails, the number was wrong, so you get shouted at maybe, whereas if you let them play and the number doesn't say they're right, but they play and they get through with it, it's, you were just lucky. It's so I think the technology stuff is an interesting one for me, because I think you end up doing a lot of things you were doing 10 years ago in terms of rehab and stuff and getting the same outcomes, just taking a wee bit longer because the number says they're not quite there yet. So
yeah, no, I definitely can understand that. I think that when we're speaking to people as well, we definitely try and encourage it to be, it's there to support your clinical reasoning and judgment and everything, because it's very easy. We get asked a lot about what's the protocol for this particular injury, and it's well, just depends, doesn't it? It depends what what's going on at that time. So yeah, no, I can definitely see that. And then also you get so much data as well, isn't it? It's what do you even do with it then?
I think so. And I think that's, if you were to ask a player what his biggest frustration would be in a rehab process or even a monitoring process, would be data that's collected and not used. So sometimes you need to collect data because it's going to allow you to retrospectively analyse things down the line. You just have to explain that to a player. But I think though that data you collect that you don't use, or it doesn't really impact on a decision, you've got to start questioning why you're collecting it. And I think that's starting to happen. I would say substantially more in the last 4 or 5 years. Whereas I think maybe 8 or 9 years ago, people were collecting data because they didn't know what it meant. So there's a reason to collect it because we're trying to understand things, but we're not quite sure what it means yet. And we do that still. You know, every year we'll collect data and go, what's it told us? Absolutely nothing. Move on. Next thing. Do you know?
Yeah, no, I think that's all you can do, isn't it? Because again, new technology is coming out all the time. Some of it is even the stuff that we get involved in. We're trying to question why we should try and sell it to people, and justify that to ourselves. Because if we come to you and try and say, this is why you need this, and you're like, why? I'm like, I don't know, actually. Because it might work. Yeah. So yeah, no, I can definitely understand that side of it. So getting back to the rugby then, how was the transition from you doing both like domestic and then international to doing purely international?
I think like I have the approach of, it's an interesting approach maybe, is the human body's the same. So irrespective of what level you're working at or treating, the body won't heal any quicker. It won't get back to play any quicker just because it's an international level or lower. It's what changes is the pressure. So going from, I guess, even like club rugby to semi-pro to pro to international, it's the pressure to return somebody changes and keep them on the pitch, because in essence, I guess the outcomes have a lot more impact on things, you know. So if you're at a World Cup, somebody who the coaches may deem critical to the team performing, if you can't get them on the pitch that weekend, they think that may have a negative impact. So the pressure changes, whereas lower down, they might go and just give them another week. We need them right for the next sort of 6 months versus we've got 2 games left in the Six Nations. We need this guy playing in both of them. Do you know? So I think the pressure changes, but I don't think anything else changes. I don't think people heal quicker. I think it's just those. It goes back to, there was a great paper written years ago, and I've always forget the author's name. It's about decision modifiers. What changes your decision-making process? And it's things like, what is it? Is it a final versus is it the first game of the season? Do you know, is the player off contract? Because he may need to play to try and get another contract with you or somebody else. Do you know, where it is in the season, like all these kind of various decision modifiers. And I think level of sport is one of those decision modifiers, you know. So how I might treat my 10-year-old son going into a game of rugby the weekend is going to be substantially different to what I tell a 28-year-old international rugby player. But also, as well as out of international windows, is what we're asking, like, we need to look at that variance between a 20-year-old internationalist and a 31-year-old internationalist. Do you know, what's the difference? You've got training age, obviously, is huge, and also their beliefs and philosophies are different. And the new generation of guys coming through really makes you think about varying backgrounds, thought processes, motivations, you know, whether that's extrinsic motivation, whatever that is. But I think like the big thing is just pressure that changes because of what's at stake for an individual player as well, you know. But your job, doesn't matter who you're working for, is to get that player to the best, like to play the highest level they can play, do you know? And that's your job, you know. It's to make sure they're in the best possible position to be made up for selection. And if you do that, you've kind of done your job. It's up to a coach whether he selects them or not.
Yeah. And so do you think that pressure transitions into like the medical team, like for you, for example?
Oh, yeah, I think you do. You do feel a bit of pressure, but I think it's about, again, going back to what am I here to do? You know, you're a risk assessor. In essence, you are the guy that decides, well, what's the risk? You know, if you've torn a calf and they've done X, Y, and Z, but they've not done A, B, and C, what's the risk of letting them train that day? Well, the risk is we don't know what will happen with this, you know. So it's about I think understanding what, really defining and knowing yourself what your role is. Your role is to assess that risk. So does pressure come on? Yeah, it does, because you're making a decision, or you're giving a coach information to let him make the decision. And I still think there's a few things like concussion, which, that's obviously in the press a lot. There's just, that's not a discussion point. That's just if they're concussed, they don't play, and there's a process you follow, and that's very black and white, for us. And you treat everyone individually, but there's not a big discussion point around that. Whereas if you've got somebody that's got a grade 1 AC joint, there's discussion about what you can do to get that person on the pitch, and what the coach, and go, this is what we can do, but they're not going to be 100%. The coach needs to decide, is that a risk they're wanting to take? We can do X, Y, and Z to make sure they're in the best position, but there's still a risk.
Yeah. No, it's true. And then in terms of what would you say? I mean, it's going to be a difficult one because I'm sure you had loads of amazing memories. But are there any particular memories of games or whatever that really stand out as like, yeah, I'd love to go back to that point?
I'd love to go back to the 2015 quarter-final and see if the ref would change his decision, which knocked us out of the World Cup. I mean, that was just, having been at Twickenham playing England, to be at Twickenham and have that amount of supporters but cheering on Scotland was phenomenal. Like, I think I still think the 2015 World Cup was great. I think it helped it was within England, because then we could get travelling support. But yeah, I think if there was a highlight / lowlight was probably that game. In terms, it was a highlight to be involved and see players like really fulfill their potential at the international stage. The lowlight being, it can be taken away from the decision of somebody else, in terms of watching, how they felt and how it impacted on them, So probably those. Was involved in a final in the ITM Cup with the Wellington Lions, which was, again, it was great. We didn't win that though, in a couple of semi-finals of Super Rugby, which were, again, phenomenal experiences. So those are probably the sort of highlights. And I don't believe success of anyone in the performance team is determined by success on the pitch. So if a team doesn't get to these things, it doesn't mean you're doing a bad job. And it also doesn't mean if you achieve these things that you're doing a good job. And I think that's really important for people to remember, because I think when you look and see teams that win, you go, they must be doing everything right. They must tick all the boxes, dot all the I's, cross all the T's, and get those 1%ers. And with experience and age, what you realise is they don't. Sometimes they've just got the best players. And irrespective of what you do in the background, they're probably going to win anyway, or they just weren't going to get there. So those are probably, in terms of highlights that I recall. I mean, I've got funny ones where I had a player I once worked with who had narcolepsy, so he would fall asleep, and he was a 140 kilo prop, and so he had this thing where he would get tingles in the front of his face, and that would identify to him that he was going to need to go for a sleep. In the middle of the game, he just looked at me and went, "It's happening." And it was like, how far can we get him towards the changing room? Basically, to get him lying on a physio bed just so he could go to sleep. And he would sleep for 3 or 4 hours, But that was probably, in terms of an on-pitch sort of highlight, sort of memory that will never leave me, just because suddenly the game's going and him and I are sprinting in the opposite direction to try and get inside.
So what would have happened, like, if you hadn't have got him in? If he'd have been playing, what would have happened?
He would have just he would have known it was coming, so he would just lay down, but he would have just gone to sleep, and we would have somehow had to manhandle a sleeping 140 kilo tight head prop, which an awake and fully conscious 140 kilo prop, to put him on a board and get him moving is pretty tough, but when they're absolutely out of it, gone. So there you go. I was the joys of interesting medical conditions.
Yeah, I've not heard of that one before.
No.
And then that may link into this as well. Are there any people that have had a particularly big influence or been particularly inspirational that you've come across?
I think, yeah, I think physio-wise, I've been very lucky, I think. Like I mentioned, a guy, Steve Griffin, in New Zealand. So him and his partner, Brett Woodley, they were partners in the practice. They ran a place called Roslyn Physio. This was in Dunedin. If they hadn't offered me the part-time work, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be where I am now without that. So they, like, in terms of gratitude, in terms of what I learned from both of them. So Brett was doing the masters with me, but he was a way more experienced physio as well. So what I learned from them was phenomenal. We had good guys at the uni there, and a guy, Pete Milosavljevic, who was worked kind of in rural New Zealand. But he was just a phenomenal physio, like in terms of clinical reasoning. Tony Schneiders, who was the president of the IFSPT at one stage, again, just he made physio fun. He was always joking, always having a laugh, but again, really good physio. And it kind of, those guys were probably inspirational. I think the one person, if I could thank them ever again, would be my studies advisor as an undergrad, was a lady called Lorna Paul, who kept me in uni, if that makes sense. Like as I said to you, like I didn't necessarily enjoy my first couple of years. I had resits to do, you know, like every summer for the first 2 years. And if I ever talk about this sort of stuff, I don't mind saying that, because I wasn't motivated. I was 17, 18, 19-year-old kid, probably wasn't mature enough, was enjoying my life outside. And she just kind of kept me on the straight and narrow at uni and kind of got me to get my essays in and pass things and get there, you know. I got a 2-2 at uni, you know, as an undergrad, you know, and I laugh because I've then gone on and done my master's in Otago Uni with distinction. I did a postgrad down at Salford Uni in terms of sports injury rehab. Didn't do the master's because I was kind of, I guess I'd already done the master's, so I didn't need that additional kind of workload at the time, because I was working with Edinburgh. And I now have, sometimes we have staff that apply to certain unis and they don't have a 2-1, so they can't get in to do the master's programme. And I'm like, what you got as an undergrad genuinely means nothing, because if you're enjoying yourself as a student and having a life and doing these things, it's all right, you know. And I think this lady, Lorna Paul, just kept me going, you know, and got me to the end. And I tell people about this because I want them to realise is what you do at uni doesn't dictate what you'll end up doing in your career, you know. So I think she was a phenomenal influence on me. And then I would say, having come back to Scotland, would be kind of, I guess, James Robson, Paul McGinley, my old boss, who I said went off to Cirque du Soleil, and then Stevie Much, who I worked with the national team, have probably been the people that have influenced, shaped, you know, me in terms of professionally, kind of in the latter stages. So I've got a few people that have influenced me. And it's just, I think it's, everyone can have that positive effect on you, you know, and they're just physio related ones. And then you've got coaches, you know, you could talk about coaches and the various personalities you meet over the years. And again, they've all shaped or influenced me. Like if Jamie Joseph hadn't given me a shot at the Wellington Lions, would I be sitting here now talking to you? Maybe not. Do you know?
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant point about that personality development and that the character that you develop at university, because I definitely see that, I value that way more now when you meet people for jobs or working with them. It's like the academic side of it is such a small part of that personality development, isn't it? And what their character's like.
Yeah, like, I mean, you also don't know, like somebody's got a 2-2, that could be 1 mark away from being a 2-1. What difference does that make? Do you know? We employ, I think you can help somebody become a better professional physio. So if you're saying there about when you're talking about employment, you can help people become better physios if you've got the right person. It's unlikely you can change personality that easily. you know. So I think personality and the way you interact in teamwork I value way more than whether you're a straight A student at school and got a first class at university. That doesn't faze me. I want to know, are you a good person? Can you work in a team? And if you can, then if there's things you need to get help with or work on, we can do that.
Yeah, no, couldn't agree more. And then last question, like when you were doing that at that point, when you were struggling in those first couple of years, could you ever even comprehend that you'd be in the position you are now of sort of working with the Scottish team?
Absolutely not. I don't. I think. Just no. No, I wouldn't. I genuinely. I look now and I sometimes like, because I've been involved in Scottish Rugby for over 10 years now, and having done the things I've done, I don't. I think I'm still feel quite lucky in a way. Like I don't underestimate the hard work I put in. Maybe as a postgrad, I would say that maybe my hard work was not there as an undergrad, but when I found what I wanted to do and what I enjoyed, I definitely worked harder. But would I, in those first couple of years working or even at university, thought I would be where I am now? Absolutely not. Not a chance. Like, you know, you look at these jobs and think they are somewhere off in the distance and you'll never get there. And then somehow I've ended up here, to be honest. It's sometimes the way I think of it. It's like, oof, still going.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good message to finish on. I would say that so many people that I've chatted about this stuff say, oh, I've been really lucky. And I think there's a lot of making your own luck in most of this stuff. So there's opportunities, but there's obviously just taking advantage of them. But yeah, Stuart, I really appreciate your time on that. I've really enjoyed chatting to you. So thank you very much for sharing those, and really appreciate it.
No, you're welcome, mate. It was nice to chat and relive some of my memories a wee bit, to be honest.
Good man, brilliant. Thanks for your time, Stuart, and I hope to see you soon.
Yeah, mate. Chat to you soon. Cheers, mate.
Bye.
Bye-bye.